Hromadske Radio, I'm the director of the Ukrainian Institute London. It's so good to see so many of you here tonight at this very important discussion about political prisoners of the Kremlin, past and present. The plight of political prisoners and prisoners of war remains one of the most painful issues for Ukrainian society. Hundreds of Ukrainian citizens continue to be held in Russia and in temporarily occupied territories in absolutely inhumane conditions and with no access granted to them by international human rights organizations. They are subjected to torture and they are deprived of the most basic rights. At best, they are treated as bargaining chips, and at worst, their lives are seen as completely expendable. The Ukrainian state, of course, is trying its best to put every effort into securing their return, yet each day spent in Russian captivity is a day stolen from these individuals and their loved ones. Of course, the Kremlin's imprisonment of Ukrainians for political purposes did not begin in 2022, nor did it start in 2014. The subjugation of those who dare resist authoritarianism is a long-standing practice, sustained largely by impunity that has been enjoyed by Moscow. The demand for accountability for these grave violations of fundamental rights remains urgent, yet it is also usually unanswered. Hearing testimonies of those people who survived what can only be described as hell on earth, I would say is not just an honor, but also a form of justice. So it is my great privilege to introduce tonight's speakers. We've got tonight with us Maksym Butkevych, a human rights advocate, journalist, public figure. Former military serviceman and former prisoner of war. He is a co-founder of Hromadske Radio and ZMINA Human Rights Centre. He was a board member of the Ukrainian branch of Amnesty International. From the first days of the full-scale Russian invasion, he joined the ranks of the Ukrainian armed forces. In June 2022, he was taken prisoner in occupied Luhansk. The so-called Luhansk People's Republic court sentenced Maksym to 13 years in a high-security penal colony as a war criminal in a fabricated case. After 2 years and 4 months of imprisonment, he was released from captivity. He returned to Ukraine as part of an exchange on the 18th of October 2024. And I will be asking for another round of applause in a minute, because yesterday Maksym was awarded the Václav Havel Human Rights Prize and became the first Ukrainian to be awarded this prize. So congratulations. We're also joined tonight by and I'm particularly pleased because we've been corresponding for a while, but haven't actually seen each other in person until this evening, so it's with great trepidation that I'm introducing Stas. He's a writer, he's a publicist, he's a veteran of the Russian-Ukrainian war. He spent 2.5 years in captivity in occupied Donetsk in the secret Oleksii prison, essentially an illegal concentration camp. He's an author of 6 books, including The Torture Camp on Paradise Street, that details his stay in Oleksii, and numerous articles on systems of torture and destruction of personality in totalitarian systems, including Syria's death camp. We're also joined by historian Oksana Kies. She's a feminist and anthropologist, head of the National Research Foundation of Ukraine, and her book Survival as Victory: Ukrainian Women in the Gulag was included in the Ukrainian Book Institute's list of the 30 most significant books of the Ukrainian independence in 2021. Welcome, Oksana. Tonight's discussion will be moderated by Samantha Nanks, KC, a barrister at Matrix, specializing in public law and international human rights. She's the chair of the advisory board of the Human Rights, I wrote this and I can't read it, Human Rights Advocacy Centre, and author of numerous books on law, rights and religion. Samantha, welcome. And last but not least, we are also joined by Daisy Gibbons, who will be helping us interpret some of the discussion. Daisy is a fantastic translator and a great friend of the UIL, so thank you for being with us today. That's all for me. There will be space for discussion from the audience, so think of your questions. We will leave enough time for you to ask them, but for now I'll pass the mic on to Sam. Thank you.
Good evening. It's a great privilege and a great honour to be with you this evening. I wanted to begin by paying tribute to the incredible work of the Ukraine Institute in London. I have enormous respect for everything that you're doing, Oleksii. I last visited Ukraine in 2003 and was fortunate enough to be able to go down to the Crimea, and I have incredible fondness and such wonderful memories of all the people I met when I was travelling down there at that time. It's also an immense privilege and an honour to be with Maksym, Stas and Oksana this evening. We could spend an entire evening just talking about their work, but we've got a lot of questions that I want to ask, and as Oleksii says, we'll make sure that there's time at the end. But I just wanted to begin with a very short reflection from my perspective, I work a lot with refugee and protection cases, and one of the issues which comes up time and time again before the tribunal in this country is credibility. And what is so difficult for my clients and so difficult is for people who've experienced torture is to be able to give testimony in a courtroom, and this sense of not being believed, because that's what is so often an issue. And so it's through the immense strength of people like Maksym and staff who are going to pave the way for these accounts, which then themselves can't be disputed once they form part of a wider body of work, together with the backdrop of work that's been done by Oksana, which is so important. So I thank all of you and acknowledge your incredible work. This event is timely in many ways. We've got the wonderful award which Maksym has just been given. We also have a report from the OSCE which has come out a few days ago, which relates to the treatment of Ukrainian prisoners of war. If you haven't read that, I would urge you all to read it. It's a very important context and backdrop to what we're going to be talking about this evening. We also have the first judgment from the European Court of Human Rights, Netherlands and Ukraine against Russia, which again is an important testimony of what is going on in the war, and in a court which is independent and which is highly respected by the international community, and that again is going to form an important part, I think, of future cases relating to accountability. So I really wanted to start by asking Maksym and Stas to give us some kind of context of the gravity and the seriousness of the situation with prisoners of war in Ukraine, political prisoners, and the kind of numbers that we're talking about, and how people are beginning to gather evidence. Maksym, shall we start with you?
Thank you very much. When it comes to Ukrainian prisoners of war and civilians who are held in Russia illegally, it is very difficult to estimate the numbers. There are no official numbers to date. it is quite clear that we talk about thousands of people when it comes to prisoners of war. Estimates vary for a number of reasons. In the first place, unfortunately, the minority of those whom we are sure about that they are in captivity were confirmed by International Committee of Red Cross. The majority of those who are in captivity, they were, as it is called at the moment in official papers, confirmed by other sources. Usually it is from Russian or Persian Telegram channels or social media with propaganda videos of these people, but the majority from testimonies of those released POWs who have seen this or that person and at this or that moment in captivity. So unfortunately, as far as according to the vast majority of testimonies, ICRC, International Committee of Red Cross, does not visit as a matter of rule the detention places. It is very difficult to estimate how many of those who are accounted as disappeared in the battle zone are really in captivity. And it brings to my mind this episode I told about several times already when we were captured in June 2022 on our way to Luhansk. We were visited by Russian military propagandists who were making videos with us for propaganda purposes. And they took us one by one to the neighboring room, and they were intrigued by me because I was the only officer, and also they Yandexed me, or how they search internet, I know they don't Google, they Yandex maybe or whatever they do, and they realized I'm a journalist. And also I said so because I knew that they will discover it sooner or later. And they started conversation with words, you think you are prisoners of war, but you are not. You just disappeared in the battle zone, and if you don't follow, pardon me, if you don't follow the orders, you might never appear again. And if you don't understand it, we'll take you to the backyard and show you hole in the soil, and you'll see the remnants of those who didn't get the message. So we don't really know how many people disappeared in the battle zone and never appeared again, disappeared in the battle zone and are still held elsewhere in detention. The situation with civilian detainees is even more difficult because quite often their relatives are afraid of getting in touch with Ukrainian authorities. And quite often their relatives don't even know what happened to them. They were just taken from their homes, or they were snitched from the streets. I myself was in prison in Luhansk with civilians who were under so-called preventive arrest, which meant that they were not charged with anything. But they were arrested for 3 months' time just in case, because previously, for instance, they served in Ukrainian army or were affiliated to national police or to local self-governance structures, and their relatives were never informed on their whereabouts. So these people effectively were disappeared, but they are in captivity. And when it comes to conditions, they vary from one place to another. According to the Geneva Convention 3, Russia had to set up centers for prisoners of war, and Russia has never done so. Ukraine created these centers, and they are open for scrutiny by international organizations. Russia has never done that. So far, more than 200 detention places are identified, both in occupied territories of Ukraine and in Russia proper, where Ukrainian POWs and civilians in Russian detention are held. Conditions vary. They were different even in the occupied territory of Luhansk region. Different detention facilities had different manner of treatment, but especially at the initial stage of captivity, systematic use of torture and inhuman degrading treatment, especially degrading treatment, and detention incommunicado are a common feature of the whole system. So it takes place from Luhansk and Donetsk regions, occupied part of it, to Siberia including, which is of course evidence to the fact that this is not some local issue, but this is a system which is controlled and dictated from above.
Thank you, Maksym. Stas, can I ask you also to comment on this and perhaps on the various institutions in Ukraine which are gathering the information and how that compares, say, to the OSCE report. The OSCE report, I think, talked about 122 places of detention, and I think put a figure of around 13,000, but it sounds as if both of those are underestimates.
Так, ви знаєте, доброго вечора. Ви знаєте, для того, щоб зрозуміти загальну картину, я назву тільки цифру, яка йде від нашого омбудсмена з прав людини України. В Україні, і ця цифра 20 тисяч цивільних на окуповану територію та Росії, які звинувачуються про українські позиції.
Good evening. I'm just going to give you the number that our National Ombudsman has given of the number of civilian people who are currently detained in Russian-occupied areas of Ukraine, and in Russia that is about 20,000.
В результаті навіть та величезна пенітенціарна система, яка є в Російській Федерації, просто не здатна помістити таку кількість людей. І просто зараз, що цікаво, саме на окупованій території Донеччини будуються декілька додаткових спеціальних таборів, де будуть утримувати виключно так званих політичних і в тому числі, я думаю, військовополонених.
However, even Russia's enormous penitentiary system is not actually capable of holding that number of people. So there are several facilities that are being built in order to house these, we could say, political prisoners, but also potentially prisoners of war.
В моєму випадку було рівно протилежне по відношенню до ситуації Макса, бо люди, які мене заарештували в 17-му році, якраз намагались довести, що я є комбатантом, частиною головного управління розвідки, і власне з цими були пов'язані мої тортури, адже я це не визнавав.
I had the opposite experience of Maksym when I was taken into captivity in 2017. The people who arrested me tried to convince me or tell me that I am incompetent and that I'm working for the main Directorate of Intelligence of Ukraine, which I did not agree to.
На сьогоднішній день 98% людей, які потрапляють до системи Російської Федерації за політичними звинуваченнями чи як військовополонені, проходять через тортури, перш за все, електричним струмом.
I would say about 98% of people who are taken as political prisoners and also as POWs in the Russian penitentiary system they undergo torture, predominantly torture from having wires and electric current attached to their body.
Це не є сюрпризом, тому що буквально на днях Путін підписав указ, згідно з яким Росія виходить з Європейської конвенції, яка забороняє катування. Путін підписав наказ.
This isn't a surprise because Putin recently signed an agreement to leave the International Convention of Human Rights, which prevents the European, sorry.
І в рамках національного законодавства Росії в них є закон, який дозволяє фізичний вплив, фактично катування підслідних, якщо це має оперативний сенс, тобто повністю позбавляє відповідальності катів.
Also, when it comes to in Russia, the nation, they are allowed to use physical violence if it can create results, if it has an operative or tactical sense in achieving their ends.
Thank you. And Stas, I think you had a sham trial. You were offered a lawyer. You were given a lawyer, but the trial had absolutely no semblance of any kind of fair trial.
По-перше, я був засуджений двічі. Кожного разу мені давали 15 років. І я насправді навіть не знаю, це 30 чи 15, але вироки я маю 2 по 15 років кожен.
In fact, I had 2 trials and I had 2 sentences of 15 years. I don't know whether that means I was supposed to have 30 years or just 15 years, but yes, that was my sentence.
Адвокати на момент 17-го року в тій системі було лише 4 людини. і вони всі були вхожі до системи Міністерства державної безпеки. Там не допускали людей зовнішньо, навіть російських адвокатів.
In the system, there are only 4 lawyers that were involved in the trial, and they were all people who were in the Ministry of State Security, which is of Donetsk, and they would not let other people take part or watch over this process.
Кожен з цих суддів пройшов буквально за 15 хвилин кожен, і другий проходив навіть без прокурора.
So each of these judges came in after 15 minutes, and that's when, and a couple of them did not even use the head prosecutor.
Суддя просто запитує вас, чи згодні ви з тим, що ви підписали, бо всі докази ґрунтуються на ваших власних показах під тортурами. І звісно, що ви маєте сказати так, я згоден, бо якщо ви кажете не згоден, повертають вас до вашого місця утримання, приїжджають хлопці, які були знайомі з вами в перший день затримання, і починаються знову катування.
And all they asked me is, gave me a piece of paper and said, will you sign this? And if I refuse signing it, then there's no other way apart from being taken back to the place where I was detained, and the same guys would come and start torturing again.
Ну і зрештою судить вас на той час, знову ж таки, якийсь найверховніший суд Донецької Народної Республіки, щоб не було можливості навіть подати апеляцію. Тобто, це вирок, який не підлягає оскарженню.
Even in the sort of highest court of the so-called Donetsk People's Republic, this is a sentence that has no grounds. So.
Thank you. I want to turn back to Maksym at this point and just really go back a little bit in time to the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the international community's failure to react. What impact do you think that had in terms of setting or paving the way for Russia's treatment of prisoners of war? Could we see things happening then which might have been prevented had the international community reacted differently?
In my opinion, of course, yes. In my opinion, what happened in 2014 in Donbass, but in the first place in Crimea, paved the way to all the things which came about afterwards, and it was an encouragement. This basically international community effectively ignoring grave human rights violations which took place in Crimea, by this encouraged Russia to go forward. Because leaving aside the very fact of the armed aggression and occupation of part of the territory, we had this report of Crimean, among them Crimean Tatar activists, being disappeared, being tortured, being murdered, and this caused no international alarm and no reaction. So basically it was a test, among other things. Kremlin tested how far can they go. And actually when we tried this and they met no significant reaction and no significant resistance internationally, they realized they can go to the next stage, what they have done effectively very soon, and at the end of the day that led to the full-scale aggression of 2022.
And Stas was mentioning the building of detention facilities, the fact that Russia doesn't have the capacity to detain the number of political prisoners overnight. It was obviously developing these. Could we see that from 2014 that Russia was developing this? Was that something that was obvious?
Well, it was visible in the first place in Crimea, because Crimea has been not only militarized gravely, but a lot of people found themselves in a situation where their whatever activities can be criminalized. And we've seen effective control of detention facilities in Crimea more and more being shaped towards imprisonment of those who have shown signs of dissent, and specifically activists from Crimean Tatar community and activists from religious Muslim communities. So Yes, I would say it was quite visible and quite obvious. It was in the plain sight, it wasn't hidden somewhere.
Thank you. I'm going to bring Oksana in at this point for the broader historical context. Oksana, is what we're seeing today, do you think, part of a really large-scale continuum of Russian aggression, something which isn't effectively new, but has got many historical precedents?
Actually, when we learn the news about all kinds of war crimes Russian military commit in Ukraine towards the local civilian population, like mass killing and looting and rapes and tortures, first and foremost, it is so shocking that it seems to us in something incredible, unprecedented. But when we look back into the history of Ukrainian-Russian relationships, at least for 300 years backwards, we can see that all the time Russian Empire repeated itself in their attempts to conquer and to subjugate Ukrainians. And the more resistance they felt, the harsher were their policies and their practices. And starting probably with Peter I, who is unfamous and whose notorious act of destruction of the capital city of Ukrainian state, Hetmanshina, the city of Baturin, where the terrible carnage took place, and over a few days, about between 11 and 15,000 of local population, women, men, and children, have been slaughtered, basically. And the city was robbed and burned to ground over a few days on the pretense of the Ukrainian Hetman Mazepa betraying Peter I. And that took place at the beginning of the 18th century, at the end of the 18th century. Catherine II destroyed the last stronghold of the Ukrainian statehood and independence, and that time the Zaporozhian siege, also like demolishing physically and killing those who stayed there. So that was harshest. And what is paradoxical to me that both rulers of Russia, Peter I and Catherine II, are also known as Peter the Great and Catherine the Great. And their greatness, they are also known as the reformers, right? Those who tried to civilize Russia, to make it more west-looking, like European country. At the cost was also this cruelty towards Ukrainians, and that continued. And in the 19th century, what we see that there was a long list of all kinds of decrees and policies restricting Ukrainian culture, like subjugating Ukrainians by eroding and restricting their culture, full of all kinds of bans and decrees forbidding Ukrainian language use in different spheres, in culture and education, in publication of books and so on. So it limited the development of the Ukrainian language. And actually the Soviets just continued that practice. And we observed not only the restriction and the attempts to destroy Ukrainian language by blurring the lines between Ukrainian and Russian language, by changing the vocabulary and the grammar of Ukrainian language, and that was the state policy. And it went through the education, so the generations of Ukrainians would learn not a real Ukrainian language, but something like a surrogate language, closer to Russian. But also, on the other hand, when the Ukrainians tried to resist and were quite organized in their resistance, then the repressions were harsher. And the Ukrainian political, cultural, intellectual elites were physically repressed in the 30s, right? You probably have heard about the Rozstreляне Відродження, the Ukrainian cultural elites being repressed and murdered in the Gulag, and the common people were just starved to death. 4.5 million of Ukrainian people died because of Holodomor, the man-made famine, because they resisted Russian imperial policies. At that time, Soviet policies. And that lasted. And then again, in the mid-20th century, we had Ukrainian nationalist underground movement, organization of Ukrainian nationalists and Ukrainian insurgent army fighting against the Soviets, and they've been repressed brutally by military force, and again ended up in the Gulag. And now we know they've been tortured during the interrogations, they've been humiliated, dehumanized in the Gulag camps and prisons, exactly because they resisted. Because those who did resist could be somehow lured into the Russian imperial culture and turned into Russian artists, into Russian politicians, into Russian intellectuals. So that was also a kind of appropriation of Ukrainian cultural resources by imperial power, and that's part of the colonial policy Russians applied towards Ukraine. So what we see now when we learn about what is going on the occupied territories, how the libraries are purged from Ukrainian books, and how immediately the schooling of the kids' education is switched to the Russian language. And what happens to those who are the activists, who have the pro-Ukrainian political standing and who openly resist, they are tortured, they are murdered, and they disappear because they are killed after all. So basically what we see throughout the history is the same practice. At different times it varies from softer to harsher and more cruel and more brutal. But what is different today, that we can learn about that we can see those crimes, they cannot be hidden, so it cannot be silenced. We can learn about those crimes, and that's necessary to speak about them. That's why I really admire the courage and the strength of Maksym and the colleagues of mine. They have this inner strength to step forward and to speak up and to raise the voice on behalf of all those who disappeared or who are still in captivity, facing all those terrible tortures and dehumanization.
Oksana, thank you. I know an important part of your work, in addition to everything that you've just been speaking about, has been the treatment of women in war. And I think that is another subject which, until relatively recently, has been completely covered up. I mean, I remember having studied history all the way through to university, almost no mention of the treatment of women in war, and then only later, having read Svetlana Alexievich's book about women in the Second World War, and your scholarship about the use of rape as a war weapon, which has been also reported on by journalists such as Christina Lamb and others more recently. Do you want to say something about the use of rape as a war weapon in the current war?
I would say yes. What we see on the occupied territories, what the Russian soldiers commit towards women is definitely, that could be definitely identified as genocidal rape, which was also seen in different places relatively recently, like in Rwanda with Srebrenica and other places, where it was like the woman's body or the rape was actually weaponized to subjugate the local population, to demoralize, to degrade the people, and also to destroy the community, because it's also about, the social cohesion. When the people are degraded to such an extent, it's much more difficult than to rebuild that community afterwards. And it is not only about impregnating the women, but also about just showing the men that they are not capable to defend their women. So it's a humiliation for the women and for the men alike. And why it was silenced for so long, I mean, those past crimes during the Second World War and other historical events. That's because it's so difficult to document those facts, because women who feel kind of shame and guilt, they would prefer to keep silent. And we know that in Western Europe, when the Red Army, so-called, went to liberate different countries, what kind of crimes they committed to the local women in Hungary, in Germany, how many women became pregnant and tried to keep it in secret, not to speak up about them, because there is this kind of stigmatization of victims, blaming the victim for not resisting enough, and that was very common. Fortunately, this attitude is changing, and the society is much more open to listen to women and to accept their stories and to support them in their thirst for justice, especially when it comes to this kind of very specific crimes. And we know that Victoria Amelina, the famous Ukrainian writer, a very talented person, young woman, who was one of those who went around the places liberated after the Russian occupation to document the facts, especially of women's experiences. And she was killed by Russians also, so she is just another victim of the war. But there are others, unfortunately. There are women's groups and initiatives who try not only to document and to help women find the words and find the courage to verbalize their experience and to share their stories, but also to help those women to recover, to come to terms with themselves and not to feel that shame and guilt, which is not there. Obviously, that was not their fault. But this kind of war crime has to be also taken into account when we speak about Russian war crimes.
Thank you. That's probably a good moment to move on to talk. Well, we're going to talk about accountability, but before we get to accountability, I wanted us to talk about international organisations and international law. Obviously, Maksym has you've spoken a bit about the International Committee of the Red Cross and their inability to have proper access. But how do you think the international organisations are coping, such as the ICRC? Could they do more? Should they do more? What's going on that level? I don't know, Maksym starts, which would we want to go first? Maksym.
Well, to me, what happens with ICRC in Russian imperialist war against Ukraine amounts almost to tragedy, because ICRC is the only organization, non-governmental organization, by the way, whose mandate is enshrined in international humanitarian law, and this mandate covers access to prisoners of war being in detention. And we see that this mandate is not fulfilled, and it has very practical implications. We were told a number of times that by our interrogators that no one has access to you, and no one knows the conditions you stay in, and therefore we can do to you whatever, because we are responsible and accountable only to our superiors, and our superiors gave us free rein. So basically, no access of international organizations and monetary bodies, ICRC in particular, encourages continuation of the practices of torture and of degraded treatment. If ICRC could do more, I don't know. I would love to hear coherent answers from the organization, because so far we see that the answers are vague, but we see that there are tools at disposal of ICRC to react to this situation more in accordance to its internationally enshrined mandate, and it's not happening. We were visited actually once in prison of Luhansk by a member of the United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission, It was in summertime of 2022. He came together with the so-called ombudsman of the so-called Luhansk People's Republic. And there will be a lot of so-called here. So it was so-called monitoring visit, which was accompanied by Russian so-called journalists, because they were from Channel Russia 24, so they were not journalists, obviously. They were propagandists. And there were a bit more than 12, I don't remember exactly, 13 maybe, prisoners of war who were pre-selected to meet this person. But before that, of course, we were gathered in a separate room, we were washed, we were given a haircut, and we were instructed what to say and what not to say. And of course, we were told they come and they go, and you stay here, and we are staying with you. And if by any chance this person will want to talk to you one-to-one, you refuse, because no matter who says what, everyone will be punished. Collective responsibility is the cornerstone of Russian penitentiary system in general and of these detention places in particular. And the propaganda videos were made how nicely Ukrainian POWs are treated in detention, although it was quite clear that this international officer of the UN, he understood pretty well actually what the conditions are, because one could wash or get a haircut, but I mean our clothes, our very appearance, it was all very visible. Anyway, that was the only time when any international organization at least tried to, well, to our knowledge, to get access to us. And this absence of international monitoring, as I said, it encourages torture, it encourages human rights violations, and at the same time, I see it as Russia's coherent, systematic policy to turn both international humanitarian law and international institutions into a joke, basically. For instance, Geneva Conventions, the word in Geneva Conventions I came across twice in captivity. Once, these military propagandists I've mentioned before, they told us, you're not prisoners of war, but when you reach your destination point and you will be registered, this is when Geneva Conventions will start to apply to you. And of course they were lying, because Geneva Conventions never started to apply to us. And second time when I came across it, it was in my own court verdict, because I was accused of violating Geneva Conventions by Russian interrogators, and I was sentenced for that specifically. Only it was Geneva Convention for treatment of civilians. It was a dark joke. And we see that other international bodies, including OSCE, maybe with the striking exception of the Council of Europe, the UN bodies, they are really turned and exploited by Russia in terms which are detrimental to the whole international security system, to the system of international humanitarian law, and system of international organizations as such.
Stas, would you like to comment on this, and in particular what Maksym has just said about the UN bodies being exploited by Russia, and your view as well on the International Committee of the Red Cross?
Ну, ви знаєте, знову ж таки, мій кейс трішки відрізняється, тому що коли ви сидите у секретній в'язниці, існування якої не визнається, то ні про які міжнародні організації і їх моніторинг взагалі не йдеться.
Well, you do know that my case is a slightly different case, because when you're sitting in a secret detention facility and it has not been announced as existing, well, no international organizations can have anything to do with this place.
В той же час мій кейс був виключенням в тому сенсі, що через 1,5 роки після свого затримання я побачив ОБСЄ.
But there is one exception where, in my case, 1.5 years 1.5 years after first being detained there, we actually saw the OSCE turn up.
Це сталося через те, що я розпочав голодування в ізоляції з вимогою, якщо, до речі, тут таке слово, щоб мене перевели до тюрми. Можливо, це, я не знаю, вперше в історії, знаєте, щоб потрапити в тюрму, почав голодування в ізоляції.
Why did this happen? Because I started a hunger strike with the demand that I could be moved into a prison, a real prison. Maybe it's the first time there's ever been a hunger strike when someone's being demanded to go to prison.
І через це, що це вийшло на підконтрольну Україні територію, засоби масової інформації, на той час на них почали, ще можна було тиснути на Росію через різні механізми, і тоді мене вирішили показати ОБСЄ, що я живий.
So, because this is happening on occupied territories of Ukraine, there was some influence from the media that could put some pressure onto Russia. So they invited the OSCE in just to show them that I'm still alive.
Але для цього мене вивезли в тюрму, в реальну тюрму в місті Донецьк, де відбулася моя зустріч з представниками ОБСЄ, і де я їм сказав, що я прошу вас хоча б про одне, щоб мене перевели ось сюди. На що вони відповіли: так, чекайте, вас, тобто не привели, а привезли сюди. Вони навіть не знали, де я знаходжусь.
So I was taken to a prison, a real prison in Donetsk, and I met the representative of the OSCE, and I told him that this is my only demand, was to come to a real prison, and he said, wait, you've been taken by transport to me, so you're not being brought to my room from this prison. You didn't actually know that I've been in a different place.
Ця зустріч ніяк не повпливала до того, щоб мене перевели в тюрму, тому що я туди потрапив тільки через рік, вже після так званого суду.
This meeting didn't actually have, it didn't change anything at all. I actually only ended up in prison a year afterwards, after the court case.
Цікаво, що навіть коли я опинився у тюрмі, буквально в перший же день мене викликав начальник однієї зі служб, який має справу з документами, і сказав: по документам ти був затриманий у 2017 році, а зараз вже осінь 2019. Де ти був?
So when I was brought into the real prison on my first day, I was interviewed by the head of some local sort of security services, and he said, "Oh, looking at your documents, you were taken in 2017. It's now autumn 2019. Where have you been?"
І коли я йому назвав ізоляцію, це йому нічого не сказав. Хоча ізоляція в 2 кілометрах від центральної в'язниці Донецька. Тому, власне, і очікувати щось від ОБСЄ чи інших Червоного Хреста, розуміння взагалі про те, що відбувається, я думаю, що ні тоді, ні зараз не варто.
And the name isolation, izolatia, he didn't understand what that meant, even though it didn't mean anything to him, and even though it's only 2 kilometers away from the central prison of Donetsk. So if this man didn't understand, then what are OSCE or Red Cross going to do about cases like mine?
Thank you. So this is, I think, a good moment to talk more about accountability and how you see cases in the future coming to court with a gathering of evidence, and what sort of tribunals should be set up or could be set up. Maksym, do you want to talk about your perspective on this?
Well, probably I could talk about this in broadest possible terms, because it is, well, on one hand it is something that we've got to do in the future, but at the same time it is something that takes place already. Those who committed crimes, both war crimes and crimes towards captives. There are Ukrainian organizations and international organizations which strive to bring them to justice using different mechanisms. There are preventive steps which should be taken, and they are taken, including personal sanctions. For instance, recently one of the heads of detention facilities in Crimea notorious for its ill treatment of prisoners, was sanctioned internationally. And it's not the first case, and I hope not the last one. But when it comes to bringing to responsibility, to me, it is very important that justice is done. Of course, being realistic, we understand that there was no war or no genocidal attempt where all perpetrators were brought to justice, unfortunately, to earthly justice at least. But to me, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't try. I think we should try to do that using different mechanisms. Currently, there are mechanisms of universal jurisdiction which are used in different countries. Of course, there are submissions to International Criminal Court. There is a special tribunal being set up which is in the process on crime of aggression, and it is very important also that this work continues. And to me, it is important not to confuse justice and revenge. There are people there who should be stopped, not because only we want justice to be done, but because if they are not stopped, they will continue to do what they do. And for instance, when I was beaten for the first time on my way to Luhansk, the person who was doing this, Russian military officer, he was a sadist. He obviously physically enjoyed it. He was beating me with a wooden stick against my shoulder, but at the same time he was doing it very professionally. It was very clear that he is doing it not for the first time, not for the second time. He was doing it before, and he later on boasted about how he tortured different POWs, hinting that we can be tortured in the same fashion. So people like him, they should be stopped in order to prevent them from committing more crimes. But again, I would not like to confuse it with revenge. And if it comes to the court sooner or later, if we take that road, then it should be a proper court, not the court like the one which convicted Stas, not the court like the one which convicted me, because my court was a little bit different. It was a proper procedure. I had a judge and a prosecutor and a lawyer, and everyone understood everything, but everyone was playing their role. It was really weird, because you are in the court hall where there are just a judge and a prosecutor and so-called lawyer and the convoy, the guards. And everyone understands everything. Everyone knows that I didn't do that. And everyone knows how these confessions were extracted. But still everyone plays their role, and you feel like you are in a mental health institution, really. You just want to say, hey, we all understand everything. And there is no video recording, and there is no audio recording. So it was just for the sake of procedure. But of course, it was not a court. So I mean, if we bring these people to justice according to formal procedures, everything should be observed. I really hope it will be done, but it is a long way to go. At the same time, yes, we currently also need to identify perpetrators. Currently, it is easier to do than in many situations of genocide before. Well, the books are getting bigger and bigger.
Thank you. Stas, do you want to come in on this? I think you've been involved in a case that came before the Kiev court with one of the perpetrators, but in particular, I suppose the question of whether justice is better done by the Ukrainian domestic system or whether better done by an international tribunal.
Ви знаєте, я дуже скептичний в цьому питанні.
You know, I'm actually very skeptical when we're talking about this idea, this theme.
З багатьох причин, перш за все, якщо ми кажемо про виконавців воєнних злочинів, то ці люди, в яких немає що забирати, і тому ні про які санкції взагалі тут йтись не може.
Especially when we're talking about the perpetrators, we can't really get to them, so we can't really put any sanctions onto them.
Міжнародна система, яка існує на сьогоднішній день, здатна створити механізми, щоб нагромадити багато судових томів по відношенню до підозрюваних у вчиненні воєнних злочинів і в кращому випадку за багато років винести заочні вироки. Міжнародна система, яка існує на сьогоднішній день, здатна тільки нагромадити дуже багато матеріалів щодо воєнних злочинців і в кращому випадку винести заочний вирок через декілька років.
And the international system that we have at the moment only has several mechanisms for sort of collecting and multiplying all the data and proofs that we have on the people who have committed war crimes, and then potentially in several years' time hold a trial of them, but where they are not present.
Чи необхідна ця робота? Безперечно, вона необхідна для того, щоб ідентифікувати людей, назвати їх по прізвищам. Чи потрібна ця робота? Вона потрібна для того, щоб ідентифікувати воєнних злочинців.
Why is this work necessary? Well, it's needed in order to identify these perpetrators of war crimes.
Але виникає питання, що робити далі?
But there's a question, what can we do after that?
Ситуація в Києві з очільником ізоляції, якого вдалося знайти і змусити наші спецслужби його заарештувати, це величезний виняток системи.
So the situation that we have in Kiev, where our intelligence and security services managed to find and identify and then arrest the head of isolation and then bring him to Kiev for a trial, that is a massive exception.
Чи є це для мене справедливістю бачити цю людину засуджену на 15 років? Частково так.
Do I see justice in this person being given a sentence of 15 years? Yeah, in a way I do.
Чому частково? Тому що щоб з такими людьми не ставалося, чи то вирок судовий, чи то їхня смерть, це ніяк не компенсує того, що вони зробили мені і ті роки, які я втратив через них.
Why do I say this is justice in a way or partial? Because this sentence they get, or whatever happens to them, death, it in no way can compensate what they have done to me and others.
В цьому сенсі я, як жертва, буду завжди, з моєї точки зору, позаду від своїх катів і ніколи їх не наздожену в цій справедливості.
Therefore, I, as in the status of victim, I will always be behind the people who have done these crimes against me. I will never be able to catch up to them in terms of justice.
Але в якості практичної відповіді на це питання, я одразу перепрошую за саморекламу, але тому я, власне, і створив Justice Initiative фонд, який займається пошуком таких воєнних злочинців за фінансову винагороду. Мені здається, що це практична складова, яка якраз провалюється в цих міжнародних інституціях.
Apologies for the self-advertisement, but I actually created the Justice Initiative Fund, and what we do is we search and try and find all these perpetrators of these crimes, and with informants or people who can give us information, we give them money in order to, so we can help find them. And this is one practical way in which these other courts can then bring them to justice.
Thank you. I'm going to open up to questions, but just so get your questions ready. But before we do, I just want to come back to Oksana for reflections on the importance of historical research, current writing, in a situation where we can't be certain what tribunals are going to take place and what court proceedings there will be. But we do know that accounts can be made and written down by journalists and writers and historians such as yourselves. I just wondered if you could talk about that and the safety for people doing this. now.
Right. That's very important work to document the stories of the survivors, of all kinds of survivors of occupation and those who have been imprisoned or tortured. But we need a little time for that, so people feel secure enough, both physically but also emotionally, and in a more stable situation when they could a little bit recover somehow from what they've been through. I have to say that in history we knew a couple of cases more or less, if I may say so, successful when the major perpetrators or the masterminds of the genocidal events have been held accountable and brought to justice, like Milosevic and Karadzic for Srebrenica, and the leaders, political leaders, and the military commanders in Rwanda, and even those who have been responsible for stirring up the hostility and the hatred, the propaganda from this radio of Thousand Hills. So even those have been also faced justice and had some legal consequences. But I see like this work inside the society even more important for the society to restore itself, to recover as a community. When people work on their traumatic experience to become stronger, to grow up from what they survived, exactly as the survivors, because that's important work. They have to feel like the survivors, not as the victims, not being victimized over and over again and re-traumatized, but also learning from their experience. That's what I'm trying to say about the women's experience in history in general, but also about the history of Ukraine, which was, there were plenty of failures, and like for 300 years our struggle against this imperial power was not really successful. We failed many times, but does it mean we were victims? It means that we remained strong inside, in the core, and we kept fighting until the independence was regained and the Ukrainian nation state appeared. And now in this final battle for our independence, for after the long way of numerous attempts to break free from the Russian dominance. This is a unique situation in history because this is probably the first time in history when we have the partners, when the entire world is on our side, or almost the entire world, right? We have those allies, and we have the nations and the countries which support us, which help us to fight back and to keep fighting, I hope, until the victory. So but coming back to that topic of human histories and human experiences, we went through all kinds of calamities during the 20th century, and many of them were huge collective traumas, like Holodomor and political repressions. And we never had a chance to work on those histories because of the oppressive regime, the Soviet regime, which tried to silence everything. And that's bad, because there was many trauma laying one on top of the other. But on the other side, we now try to learn more about our history, and we are proud of being able to survive all those experiences. The only thing we have to know that unpunished evil gets stronger, goes bigger, and hopefully this will be the time when finally the Russian Empire, this aggressive empire will be stopped and also responsible. I see the only solution for that. The empire has to dissolve, and that will be the only way to prevent the future aggression from them. Because as long as the Russians have resources, feel strong enough, they will continue repeating like these attempts to finish Ukraine off, like to erase Ukraine and to absorb Ukrainians. And that's not only about territory, that's about the very fact of existence of Ukrainians. And Putin basically never keeps it in secret that for him Ukraine doesn't exist or have no future, have no right to exist. So that's the existential war, and this is the genocidal war we have to win. Otherwise, we just disappear as a nation and as a nation state.
Thank you. On the subject of solidarity, I was walking on this very small footpath in the southwest of England recently, and there was a series of stones with the Ukrainian flag painted on them. I mean, it couldn't be further away from London, and not many people walk along this path, but it was just, for me, this sort of symbol of the immense support and solidarity there is for Ukrainian people here. So we're going to open for questions. I'm going to take 2 or 3 questions, and then I'm going to invite our panel to choose which one they want to answer. So 1, 2, and 3. Please. And could you keep your questions short so that we can get through as many as possible?
Yes, sure. My name is Maria and I'm a human rights advocate born and raised in Luhansk. Nice to meet you, my dear colleagues. It's all my heart is with you always. For me, as a person who saw occupation in 2014 and whose mom was tortured and captivated for some time, and the person who lives here in the UK for 3 years, I wouldn't say that I see a lot of understanding of what is going on in Ukraine every day on a regular basis, apart from upper middle class people in London. And when I was doing my master's here in Human Rights Centre, the oldest one in the UK in Essex, people would ask me, like, why do you talk only about Ukraine? There are so many conflicts in the world. And I understand this, I truly do. I don't have an answer, except if it's not a competition of the, sorrow. But I would like to ask all of you to reflect, how would we keep this agenda of Ukrainian people, not the political agenda, on the limestone? Because for me, as a person from Luhansk, it's about people always. My heart is broken when there are all these peace deals saying, like, oh, we need to give away Crimea or Luhansk, but it's about people. So what is your reflection? Sorry, it's not short.
Thank you. And the question behind you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for sharing the experiences. My name is Tatiana Nesterchuk. I'm one of the trustees of UIL. I'm born and raised in Donetsk, and I'm a lawyer barrister. I represent 2 former prisoners of war who were held in captivity in the so-called DPR. My question is, I know that all of you are advocates for those who have been held and tortured by Russia illegally. We've discussed lots of different routes to holding Russia accountable, but my question is, what do you think is the most effective way, in your experience, that the international legal community and general community can support the prisoners of war and do something to stop this state-mandated practice of torture of prisoners?
Okay, so we've got 2 quite big questions, so I think we'll start with these 2. So, how to keep the importance of Ukrainian people in everybody's consciousness, and what international community can do. Maksym, should we start with you? You can choose which or both.
Well, these are 2 big questions, and to none of them there is one clear-cut answer. On the first question, when it comes to how to keep Ukrainian people on the agenda internationally, and especially in wider Europe, I would say, let's put it this way. To me, one of the biggest mistakes which is made by people in many European countries is when they start to say this is just another conflict. And we, of course, sympathize with Ukraine, because, well, we sympathize with the underdog. But otherwise, well, there is Ukraine and there is Gaza and there are a lot of other places in the world. But there are some certain differences. In the first place, this is taking place in Europe. And it's not only about like in our neighborhood, although it is in our neighborhood. But this war of aggression of Russia, it is waged not only against Ukraine, it is waged against all peoples who actually value human dignity and human rights. And this is, in the first place, European system of collective security and European principles enshrined in European Convention of Human Rights, which are subverted by this. Russian military officers and Russian propaganda, they don't even try to hide the fact that they do not consider this war to be waged against Ukraine. They always repeat that this is war against West, against the degraded liberal West, which has forgotten the traditional values, what they are. And Russian soldier is so ready to remind them about it. So, I mean, of course one can say, this is some distant Russian-Ukrainian war, but if Ukraine would fall, and Ukraine will never fall, but if Ukraine would fall, then the question is who is the next, and who is the next after the next. So Ukraine defends much more than territorial integrity, even much more than the independence of the state. It defends fundamental values, which a lot of societies are based upon, including this particular one. So this is something that I think a lot of people don't understand. And it is difficult to understand, but I mean, Ukraine is lonely in its experience, and I would prefer Ukraine to stay lonely, because it would mean that war, Russian war, doesn't come to other countries. But if Ukraine is left lonely in terms without international support, paradoxically, dialectically, it will stop being lonely because Russians will come. Not only Russians, but I mean all those who want to destroy the values which are our cornerstones and which are totally absent in the ideology of the Russian world. And when it comes to the second question, it is a very difficult one. I mean, the dissemination of information regarding both civilian prisoners and prisoners of war and conditions they are held in, it is essential, it is crucial. To me, of course, it is very important to continue to advocate and to pressure for creation of independent international mechanisms of monitoring of conditions of detention. Would it be ICRC or no matter who else, but someone should be there, someone should be present, someone in the presence of whom it would be less possible to torture. So this is important, and the work of lawyers in the field actually is important. I had a real lawyer, not from the beginning. No, of course I had several lawyers who filled all the protocols in my criminal case, whom I've never seen in my life. Never, not a single time. One and then another one. They were all present during interrogations. Of course, they were not. They were all paid from Russian budget. This is something I really like. Okay, I don't mind actually. This is a very good way of spending Russian budget. Better paid lawyers who never do anything than spend this money on weapons which would be used against Ukraine. And the lawyer who was present in the court actually has never seen neither me nor my criminal case before the very court session, but she had the badge of the United Russia political party. So it was all very clear. But at the same time, there was a human rights lawyer in Moscow who signed the agreement with my parents and who lodged an appeal, and then we went to the Court of Cassation. And he was important at least because he could deliver me some news about my loved ones, about my relatives. Unfortunately, the role of lawyers currently in Russia is reduced to this. But internationally, I would say monitoring mechanisms and also support to mechanisms of bringing perpetrators to justice. This is something that should be done.
Coming to the question about, what shall we do to keep Ukraine on the agenda, I would say we should focus not that much on Ukraine, but on Russia and on their criminal activities. So the spotlight should be on them. And what we need to understand and to keep in mind and to be aware of that if this country goes away with what they've done, just trashing the international law, being a member of the United Nations Security Council, being a nuclear power, having a nuclear weapon, and just totally, destroying the international security system. If they will be successful with this crime, all the authoritarian regimes all over the globe would follow their example. We already see that, how those powers come together and try to make alliances, because that would be a very dangerous precedent for the entire globe. If the world has no instrument to deal with the perpetrator, then the others would follow their steps, and then what happens? So the Ukrainian case is specific because it's not Ukrainian case, it's Russian case. We should think about what happens if Russia faces impunity instead of facing justice and being held accountable, or at least stopped and limited in their ambitions and their attempts. That's why it is important. And I think the only way to stop the tortures by Russian murderers, criminals, is to stop Russia, to stop the regime. That's the only way. Otherwise, they will keep going and doing whatever they want to do as long as they possibly can. The international community should not consider like applying those, just dealing with the specific aspects of the international crime we face, we watch, we deal with. We should think about the major perpetrator, which is using different techniques and different methods, like bombing the civilians in their homes and killing those kids sleeping in their beds, murdering Ukrainians in the prisons, or doing the other types of crimes in Ukraine and around the globe, because this is already for a long time, this is a hybrid war, and we know about that. It's also about information being weaponized. It's also about different types of subversive activities all over the globe. It's about corrupting the political elites in different places. And I'm very happy for Moldova, by the way, who made their European and their democratic choice by voting for democratic president. Basically that's it. Sorry for being that long.
Ви знаєте, цей аргумент, що ми воюємо за весь вільний світ, і якщо не буде України, ви будете наступні, він, очевидно, не працює.
Obviously, this argument, are we fighting for the entirety of the free world, and if it's not going to be Ukraine, then who? It's not the most appropriate argument we should be using.
Бо він натикається на контраргумент. Російська армія за 3 роки вторгнення застрягла десь на якомусь селищі на Донеччині. Ви серйозно говорите про Естонію та НАТО?
Because really, if the whole of the Russian army has somehow managed to get stuck along a line of some settlement in Donetsk Oblast over 3 years of invasion, do you really think that Estonia and NATO are next?
Що є кардинально невірно, і я думаю, що ми в цьому переконаємось буквально в наступні пару років.
What I categorically believe in is that we will find out the result of this in the next few years.
Але я дивлюсь на цю проблему трішки ширше і думаю, це пов'язано не тільки з Росією, а в цілому зі зміною етичної парадигми в світі, відношення до людини як такої.
I also look at this in a slightly wider context, not just in terms of Russia, but in the change of the ethical paradigm of people across the whole of the world.
Проблема в тому, що світ все більше поляризується на диктатури та демократію.
The problem is that the world is getting more polarized into dictatorship and democracy.
А диктатури мислять виключно територіями, вони не мислять людиною як цінністю взагалі.
And dictatorships, they just think about territory. They don't think about people at all as a value.
І насправді навіть зараз, коли йдуть перемовини у Сполучених Штатах і дискусія про Україну, ви можете побачити, що мова йде теж про обмін територіями, забуваючи про те, що окупація України Росією означає величезні концентраційні табори чи табір для людей, які знаходяться в підвалах. А як я сказав, їх тільки з офіційними даними 20 тисяч цивільних.
And in these talks, obviously, that we've had recently of, say, the US and Russia about Ukraine, they talk a lot about exchanging territories, but they seem to forget about people and the people who are under Ukrainian territory occupied by Russia. They forget about this network of concentration camps holding people there. And as I've said before, there are 20,000 people who are political prisoners who are still there under occupied territory.
Ну і звичайно, коли мова йде про Росію, яка легалізувала катування, говорити про механізми, які можуть на неї вплинути щодо відношення до наших військовополонених чи цивільних, ну це досить умовна річ. Я боюсь, що на сьогоднішній день таких механізмів фактично вже і не залишилось. Тільки особисті контакти на дуже високому рівні лідерів там західного світу з Путіним і його оточенням.
When it comes to trying to find some sort of mechanisms or processes that could influence Russia, a state which has legalized torture, and change the situation influence the situation for our POWs and other political civilian prisoners. I think there are very few processes. The only possible way is to go right to the top of personal contact between leaders of countries.
Thank you. A couple more questions. Question here and question at the back.
Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation and for the strengths you have to share the experience you went through, and that you managed to do that even with irony and humor. And yeah, this is amazing. And I just want to come back a bit to the question of justice and law. And when you were sharing your experience, how you were going through court proceedings under being on the occupied territory, it made me think about the next question. Why do you think Russia and Russian occupational authorities in Donetsk, in Luhansk, why they're so obsessed with keeping visibility of legal mechanisms in place? Like Maksym shared that he had a lawyer who never managed to protect him. Stanislav shared that he had all these court proceedings. Why do they try to keep it looking legal? Maybe this question also can be extended to Oksana based on your historical research, but Soviets were also trying to make these processes to look legal from a legalistic point of view. Thank you.
We've got a question, man at the back, and then.
Is it unlikely that Ukraine will experience real justice unless Russia is comprehensively and humiliatingly defeated on the sovereign territory of Ukraine and its imperial project deconstructed?
Thank you. One more at the back. One more question at the back, and then we'll come back to our panel.
Maksym, you mentioned that to be treated as prisoner of war, you need to be registered as prisoner of war. And Stanislav also said that to know where you're located, like for the outside authorities, you the prison has to be registered somewhere. And what you were discussing today, it feels like you really have to be legally savvy to know how you should be treated according to international laws. Because I suspect that in reality, like a regular resident or even soldiers on the battlefield, it's unlikely that they know all these, international details of what they are entitled to, even though the international organizations like the Red Cross are not doing a great job protecting the people in captivity. However, I'm not sure that the people who get into captivity know even about all these rights, their rights. Do you think that learning or teaching Ukrainian citizens and Ukrainian soldiers about these international laws and rights will help somehow them protecting themselves when they are captured, or protecting or allowing them, enabling them to fight against the tortures that they are experiencing in captivity? Thank you.
Three great questions. I wonder whether our panel wants to take one question each, given time. Maksym, should we start with you? Do you want to give your reflections?
Okay, well, may I just tell a short story on not short answer to the first one and even short answer to the third one. But when it comes to the obsession of Russians with the formal procedures, I would word it this way. It was a mystery to me as well. Actually, there was a moment when, not long before my court had to take place, my interrogator called me, one of them, actually the one who was kind of calmer and treated us in a better way. And he warned me that there will be court session very soon, so don't play hero, because if you say that you were not doing this, you know what happens next, and you will say yes anyway, sooner or later. And I said, well, what's the point of the whole court? Will there be a court, like prosecutor and judge and lawyer? And he said, yes. I said, why? You can just print out the verdict, put a stamp on it, and I go to the colony. And everyone pretends the court session takes place. And no one will say anything. He said, because it's the procedure. And I said, okay, but what's the point of the procedure? And he said, the point of the procedure is that it's the procedure. It was his answer. I think they want to create at least a visibility of rule of law. Actually, this question can be applied to contemporary Russia on different levels as well. Why do they hold elections? Like, what's the point to hold elections if everyone understands, at least when it comes to presidential elections, that he is not the president. He is a Tsar or whatever, father of the nation, whatever you name him. But to kind of, at least formally, to create the visibility that there is a rule of law. They change laws, they criminalize new things, so they try to, I really dislike all these comparisons to Nazi Germany, but Nazi Germany as well tried to change the laws. It doesn't mean that there was anything resembling human rights, but the rule of law before committing Holocaust, they had Wannsee Conference, where they decided what will be the legal framework for it. So, to me, they really try to kind of play, also it gives some sort of assurance to the Russian population that there are certain rules of the game. And if you play by the rules which are dictated by the authorities, you will not be punished. You will be even fed. And that these guys are really war criminals, Ukrainian prisoners of war. Because we were used for propaganda purposes, of course. And for that, they needed some sort of court. But still, this question remains a mystery to me on different levels. What's the point of the procedure? And when it comes to knowledge of international humanitarian law, well, currently it is much more popular than ever before in Ukraine, both as a field of studies and research, and just a subject of general knowledge. I think it should be taught to Ukrainian defenders, but not to protect themselves in captivity. International law will not help you to protect yourself. I had a brother-in-arms, a Ukrainian officer, who was sentenced on fabricated charges. Same story, confession extracted under torture. And he arrived to the penal colony where I was. And he told the colony administration, the camp administration, that he will not go to work because as an officer, according to Geneva Convention 3, he has the right not to work. They said, okay, and have beaten him savagely. And they said, it's the first lesson. If you will continue to be stupid and stubborn, you'll learn it the hard way. And we actually had to convince him to agree and to work because he had to get out of there alive and to an extent possible healthy. So one could try, of course, to, when you've got electric wires attached to your body parts, say, hey, listen, this is against Convention Against Torture, and this is against Geneva Conventions, and they will say, okay, and switch on the electrical current. So, people, those who go to fight for Ukraine, they should be taught about captivity, but in a different way. They should be taught do's and don'ts, and in the first place, that whatever they say or sign in captivity or say on record has zero credibility in Ukraine. This is a very important thing to know. International law should be taught for us to understand what are the international norms of treatment of their POWs when they are taken captives. I think it is important. But in captivity itself, it doesn't help.
If I may, about this strange performance with the court and everything. We should also remember that even during Stalin's times, they also pretended to have this, to follow the legal procedures and have this semblance of trials towards the political prisoners. I believe for the Russians, for the Russian Empire and for the Soviet regime and for the present day Putin's regime, it is really important to pretend they are civilized people. They are not barbarians. Whatever there is kind of law, legislation, procedures, they follow the rule, they are not barbarians. And they really badly want to be the members of the international community of this club of respected countries, civilized countries, and that's why there is election. That's why there is all that performance around, keeping the legislation. The difference is that all that play doesn't work any longer. But during the Soviet times, already after Stalin, during the Khrushchev and Brezhnev era, some dissidents really learned the rules and the legal nuances of the prisoners, of rules and regulations which apply to the political prisoners, and they really tried to work around those flaws of the systems, and they succeeded many times. So it was important for them. That was one of the survival strategy for the political prisoners, to remind their guards and all these overseers that there are some rights and there are limits, and that worked at that time. It doesn't work any longer, as Maksym and Stanislav testifies. So all of that is only the empty game nowadays, and you cannot make any reference to the international law, to the national law, to whatever law, because there is only law, the law of cruelty and violence and just brutal force, and that's it. So I would say this system degrades even further. I mean, the Russian repressive machinery degrades even further, and that's because we never had. I mean, we in that Soviet Union, we never had the proper process of de-Stalinization or decommunization, and those who were involved, who were rank-and-file perpetrators, were never held accountable. Perhaps some of the leaders have been condemned in a way, but we never had that proper process as in the Nazi Germany, the denazification, the comprehensive purging of the society of all the ideology and everything related to Nazism. I believe it's extremely difficult to deal with Russia on that level, especially keeping in mind that we don't have the occupying forces on Russian territories like allies to establish the specific regime and to implement anything like the imperialization or whatever it is. But we have to be aware that the system is really bad, and we cannot play after the rules if the other part is breaking all the rules and just doing what they want to do. We need, to come to peace by force, as it was already promised many times, but without helping Ukraine with proper weapons and whatever we need to defeat Russians and Russian regime. I am afraid this evil will go further and further, and the others will join in.
Thank you, and Stas, final word with you.
Я можу лише погодитися зі всім, що сказано в якості відповіді на перші два питання.
I can just agree. All I can say is I can agree with the answers to the first two questions.
А щодо третього питання можу додати, що інколи для більш специфічної аудиторії я читаю лекцію під назвою «Особливості поведінки людини під час допиту з застосуванням тортур». Я думаю, це є відповіддю на ваше питання, що треба знати нашим військовим і цивільним, якщо вони потраплять в полон. Особливості поведінки людини під час допиту з застосуванням тортур.
In regards to an answer to the third question, for a more specific audience, I often give lectures to my audience about specifics in how to behave whilst under interrogation and torture. So maybe that gives you an answer to the sort of information and training that people are being given in this regard.
Okay, Maksym's actually going to come back on the second question.
Second question, yeah, right, because, I'm afraid we really want justice. We want justice to be done. I'm afraid we have to get used to the thought that we live in a situation when we'll have to deal with 50 shades of justice. Not one absolute justice which is achievable, unfortunately not. I think that without the defeat of Russian imperialism on Ukraine, at least on Ukrainian territory, there will always be a feeling that comprehensive justice has not been done, in short.
Thank you. We are going to have to draw this evening to a close in terms of the formal part of this evening, but I hope we will carry on conversation informally. I just wanted to say a huge thank you to Oleksii and to the Ukrainian Institute of London. It could not be more important that you are here and that you are doing the work that you're doing. Thank you to the audience for coming, for being here and for your questions, but most of all for our incredible panelists, our two heroes, Maksym and Stas, to Oksana. What they have told us this evening needs to be heard by every single European and world leader who cares about the future of global security. This is a huge existential threat for us all, and we must all think and act consciously about this. But I really want to pay tribute to the three of you. Thank you so very much for coming and